Slug It, written by Charles Bran, narrated by Larissa Thompson. Chapter 10. When I left the dorm building after helping Mel collapse into bed, the night air was still uncomfortably hot and humid. I jogged back to the van, stepped inside, and slammed the door closed with a bit more force than normal. I took a deep breath and tried to calm my racing pulse. Chalmers wasn't lurking beside the van this time. He hadn't been following me. I was tempted to call Val and tell her what happened, but if I told her about Chalmers, I would have to tell her about visiting the strip club earlier too. I knew I couldn't get away with omitting anything. Val was too sharp not to get the whole story out of me, and I didn't want to admit that I had lied to her about searching campus for Zev, at least not if I could avoid it. And then there was the fact that what scared me most would make me sound like a crazy person. But my mind was playing tricks on me. Chalmers couldn't have really lifted the van all the way off the ground. That was absurd. And I had already embarrassed myself in front of Val by freaking out about Zev earlier today. I didn't want to come to her with yet another worry that might turn out to be nothing. I especially didn't want to call her now, late at night. If I did decide to talk to Val, and I didn't think I would be tomorrow in the office. I didn't want to sound like I panicked over every little thing. And there was no need to panic, now that I knew Zev was okay. Val was right. If Zev's whereabouts hadn't been accounted for after the fire, we would have heard something by now. If only Zev had his phone, he could have told me himself. But seeing as someone had carried Zev out of the building, his phone had probably been lost in the fire. I wanted to hear his voice, even if he was going to be making fun of me for worrying about him. The fact that the person who carried Zev out of the building had kept his face covered made me concerned that he actually wasn't okay. But I knew I shouldn't give much thought to those fears, not after what Val had told me. Besides, the police and firefighters had reported no serious injuries or loss of life. It was still hard to believe that Zev might have stumbled upon some kind of genuine criminal conspiracy in the quiet little town of Riverside. But the fact that Chalmers had showed up to scare me away from asking questions about Angela Miller proved that something was going on. Riverside may be small and isolated, but it was also a short drive from the Fairview Casino. I had heard that the Dover Delight catered to gamblers with winnings to spend. Supposedly, the strip clubs in Fairview were regulated to be topless only and were forbidden to serve alcohol. Dover was worth the drive to high rollers who wanted to see fully naked women while getting hammered. On top of that, the arrest of Tiffany Fisher was proof enough that prostitution was happening in Dover. The real question was whether Angela Miller had been telling the truth when she told Zev that a corrupt official was in on it. Val was right to point out that Miller had made a lot of other dubious claims, but that didn't necessarily mean everything she said could be dismissed. Well, when Zev came back, we were going to figure this out together. He was going to have my help whether he wanted it or not. I was going to tell him I don't want any credit. I didn't want to bogart the story. But Zev needed to be more careful, and to have someone in his camp who could stop him from taking stupid risks, like asking Burke directly about Angela Miller when it was possible Burke was involved. And now Chalmers had proved that the corrupt official wasn't the only source of potential danger. Zev also needed someone who could keep him skeptical. Zev had assumed that Angela Miller was in trouble because he hadn't heard from her in 2 weeks, but it was possible that the woman had simply ghosted him when she realized that shining a light on local prostitution might lead to her own arrest, and that Zev's story wouldn't help her friend Tiffany Fisher either. Of course, it was also possible that she had been murdered, possibly by Deputy Chief Burke, who knew that Zev was looking for her. I sighed as I reached the edge of the college and hit a red light. Thinking about what I'd do when Zev came back was all well and good, but I still didn't know where I was going to park tonight. I was going to waste gas if I drove around without a destination, so I turned off the road and pulled into the parking lot of a grocery store. It was time to buy some shelf-stable snacks and consider my options. The west side of Dover was pretty empty, as a rule. A few businesses still operated out of the endless industrial parks, but the farther west you went, the more you saw nothing but boarded-up windows and crumbling walls tagged with spray paint. There might be a place where I could park for the night in the clusters of broken buildings and cracked pavement. What about the old button factory? The property owner had given me a tour of the building for a story about the history of Dover, so I knew that the parking lot for the factory was up on a thickly forested hill, well out of sight from any cars that would be driving by. No, wait. That driveway had a padlocked fence blocking it. Besides, trespassing on private property was a risk I should avoid taking. That was when it came to me. The perfect place to go. I knew about a parking lot that was actually designed for you to just sit in it. It even had a public bathroom, which was an important amenity I had forgotten to consider. The rest stop off the highway wasn't exactly convenient to the rest of Riverside. It lay 20 minutes to the south, closer to the casino. Driving to the rest stop would cost me some gas, but it was the safest and most convenient overnight parking I could think of. And it didn't hurt that the rest stop was also a fair distance away from the stretch of woods that Chalmers had disappeared into. I paid for my nuts and jerky and left the grocery store. I checked to make sure the doors were locked 3 times before I kicked off my shoes and socks and settled into bed. Sleep did not come quickly. The night was hot and muggy, and I found myself missing the standing fan that I had lost in the fire, not just to cool off, but also as a source of white noise. The occasional sound of cars passing on the highway was going to make it hard to sleep. After I made sure that the blackout curtain was secure and reminded myself that there was no breeze inside the van to disturb it, I pulled off my jeans. Living in the van for 2 months was doable. Granted, I'd have to put on clothes and shoes to go to the bathroom, but that was just like camping. I could camp out for 2 months. My van was getting old. It wasn't going to last forever. And there was no way I was going to call my father for financial help if I needed a new car. I had to make it on my own, to prove to my father that he had been wrong to tell me that I should reconsider my fancy-pants New England college and go to a trade school. Of course, my father had thought the reason I had gone to ASU had been because I had been chasing after the boy I'd had a crush on all throughout high school. And although I hated to admit it, that had been the reason I had checked out the school initially, but after I had visited Riverside for a college tour, I had realized that it was where I wanted to be. Downtown Riverside was bursting full of quaintness and charm, but it was also only 10 minutes away from a strip club and half an hour away from a casino. ASU was a nice, comfortable place that was also wild and unrestrained, in a state with the motto, "Live free or die." I had told myself that if I went to Riverside, I would finally be free of the stodgy, stuffed shirt farm town I'd grown up in. I told myself that this would be a place where I wouldn't be the weird girl who no one liked. I had imagined that I might get a part-time job dealing cards at the casino, although that had been before I had actually gone there and seen that all the female employees were conventionally beautiful women in slinky, low-cut dresses. I also told myself that after coming to Riverside, I'd find someone who would look at me and see someone special. I knew that if I really wanted to, I could have sex. There were guys out there who would jump on anyone just for a chance to get their rocks off. But I had no interest in being a notch in someone's bedpost. I had always wanted to find someone I respected and admired, who would see me the same way and choose me over everyone else. But that was probably asking for too much. Whatever. Even though coming to Riverside hadn't fulfilled my every fantasy, I still liked it here. I didn't want to leave. If I lost my job at the Sentinel, would I have a choice? I sighed heavily. These were not the kind of thoughts that would make it easy to fall asleep. Well, as long as I was going to be awake anyway, I decided I might as well check my phone. No new text messages. 11 new emails. I started reading through them. Tomorrow, I would have to make up for the fact that I hadn't worked on anything today. 9 of the emails went straight to the trash. One of those that remained was a message from a guy saying that his landlord had taken 9 days to repair his air conditioning. He wanted us to warn people about this slumlord. I rolled my eyes and tossed that message in the garbage after the others. Another email concerned a new initiative at the library, loanable baking pans and molds for birthday cakes or other special occasions. Interesting enough for a few paragraphs and a photo, probably. I hammered out a quick reply, asking about a good time to stop by and talk about the program. The last email I read sent a jolt of electricity up my spine that intensified as I finished reading it. Miss Cartwright, I am an employee at the Dover Delight who overheard your conversation with my coworker and boss in the club today, and I think I might know some information you may be interested in. I don't want anyone to find out I'm contacting you. It's not worth risking my job. I hope that we can speak in private and that you can keep my identity confidential. Please let me know if this will work for you. I started typing a reply right away. I knew that I should have felt some trepidation given what had just happened with Chalmers, but all I felt was excitement. My fingers flew across the keyboard and produced a message with so much speed that I didn't trust what I had written until I had proofread the message 5 times. I tweaked it obsessively, trying to make myself sound both friendly and professional. Finally, the message looked ready to send, but I hesitated. I wasn't stealing the story from Zev, was I? Well, this person wanted to talk to me, not Zev. Being passed off to another journalist might spook them, and it would just be a conversation. If I could convince this source to go on the record, I could help Zev set up an official interview. All I would be doing was checking out a lead for him to make sure it was a good one. I made another small tweak to my reply and sent it. Chapter 11. I was sitting in the editor's office, the small, windowless cubbyhole down by the newsroom. On the other side of the desk in front of me sat a short, stout man wearing a rumpled white shirt with a brown tie. The light dimmed, and I could see that his hair was black and woolly, arranged in a semicircle around the huge bald spot in the center of his head. He was talking crap. I should have been paying attention. I didn't want to get in trouble on my first day. To start you off with, is that all right? Yeah, I said, not knowing what I was agreeing to. No problem. Remember, he said, we're the first draft of history. The history of a bake sale? I asked, and then immediately regretted it. Great way to make a first impression, questioning why I wasn't given a more important assignment before I had done anything to prove myself. Sorry, I stuttered. I just meant... The man just smiled. Listen, he said, every story's important. Any person you interview could be the mother of the next president, the father of the next great American novelist, the brother of a war hero. And if that happens, the biographers are going to look to you. Yes, even to a story about some little bake sale, to tell them something about where that person came from. I blinked at that. The man in the rumpled shirt grinned at me. This guy really was a good editor. Inspiring. He made me want to try to write the best bake sale story I could write. And then his face started twisting before my eyes. I gasped and staggered back from him. The man's shoulders started swelling up, tearing through the sleeves of the cheap button-down shirt and shredding it to reveal a black muscle shirt underneath. The black wool on the man's head thinned to a close-cut fuzz, and more of it sprouted from his bald pate. His jaw cracked as his head swelled and became blockier. Vince Doberman was sitting on the other side of the desk in an expensive-looking leather armchair. The setting sun cast orange light through the window of the office. Vince was too good for the traditional editor's cubbyhole. He hadn't wanted to give up his corner office on the second floor. Doberman sneered at me. I don't want you asking those questions, girlie. You ain't got the stones. The big man punctuated his words by slamming his fists down on the desk 3 times in a rhythm. His fists clanged against the wood with a strangely metallic banging sound. But I wasn't going to let this guy intimidate me. "Shut up, Dogwood," I shot back. "I'll ask questions if I want to." The huge man suddenly pointed at me and laughed. "Look at yourself," he said. "I'd say you're a butterface, but what's a guy even supposed to do with those bug bites?" I glanced down at myself. I was naked. I gasped and tried to cover myself, cheeks burning hotly. I spun away from Doberman and ran out of the room, pulling open the heavy steel door and dashing into the darkness. I heard the heavy door slam shut behind me. For some reason, it slammed 3 times. Clang, clang, clang. When the door closed for the final time, I was left alone in the darkness. At least until I blinked and realized that it wasn't dark in here after all. It was dim, but the orange light of the setting sun managed to illuminate the large, empty warehouse. Light filtered through the windows poorly because they were frosted over by a layer of dust and grime. I could hear static in one of my ears. It sounded like a radio that was out of tune. I tried to ignore the static. It was just a distraction. I had to watch the creature in front of me. If it made any sudden movements, I had to be ready to defend myself. The scarecrow stood across from me, red eyes literally glowing with murderous rage underneath the shadow of his wide-brimmed hat. The row of buttons sewn into a crooked smile twitched as he spoke to me in an unfamiliar voice. A woman's voice. "I'm warning you," the scarecrow said. The scarecrow raised one hand, and I took an involuntary step back. My heart was pounding in my chest, pounding so hard and so loudly that I could hear it making a strangely metallic banging sound as it thumped against my ribcage. I don't understand," I pleaded with the scarecrow. "Don't hurt me, please!" A flickering flame appeared above the scarecrow's outstretched palm, small at first, but swelling and growing until it was a baseball-sized ball of fire. I stared in shock. I knew that I was supposed to be calm. If I let myself be afraid, horrible things would happen. But how could I remain calm when something impossible was happening right in front of my eyes? The scarecrow was conjuring a ball of fire. But how could it be doing that? It was impossible. It didn't make any sense. Clang, clang, clang! The sound was coming from behind me. Someone was pounding a fist against the metal door into the warehouse. "No," I thought. "No, don't make any noise. If you startle that monster." But it was too late. The scarecrow was already reacting to the sound. It swung its hand forward and a plume of flames erupted from its outstretched hand and rushed at me. I tried to turn away, but all I managed to do was move my face to one side as the fire enveloped me with searing agony. The pain was incredible. I felt it across my cheek, my nose, and my left eye. I thought I could feel my left eye searing, burning away. The fire felt like it was invading my head, burning me from inside my eye socket. I had no thought but yearning for the pain to stop. I would do anything to get rid of that pain. And believe anything. Lie to yourself if you have to. Clang, clang, clang! I woke up gasping from the phantom sensation of burning pain. I panted in the darkness of the back of the van and reached up to touch my left cheek. The skin there was smooth and unharmed. I blinked and could feel my eyelid passing over my left eye. It was intact. It took me a moment to realize that a sound had woken me. A loud, metallic thumping. It hadn't been part of the dream. Someone had been banging against the side of the van. But why? Had someone backed into me or something? I groped around in the darkness, trying to find my jeans. That was when I heard the sound of the van's front door opening, accompanied by a sudden increase in the volume of the wind and the crickets. I was too startled to react. I was sure that I had locked all of the van's doors. I had checked them. I was sure I had checked them. A man's voice called out. "Is someone in there?" What? "Geez, we were just about to tow you," a gruff voice said. "Why didn't you say something when I knocked before?" The sound of the evening air was loud, and the man's voice was crisp and clear. There was nothing but a curtain separating us. "I was sleeping," I said as I scrambled to locate my jeans. "Stay where you are," the man barked, with enough authority that I identified him as a police officer. "Hang on," I called. I felt my jeans and shoved one of my legs into them. I had been about to shove in the other when a bright light suddenly shone into the back of the van, blinding me. The man was holding a flashlight, and he had shoved the curtain aside. On reflex, I whipped the sheet back over my bare leg. My face felt hot, either from outrage, embarrassment, or both. I hadn't left the van unlocked, I thought. I was sure of that. This guy must have broken in. What the hell did he think he was doing? The light blinded me for a second more, and then there was a clicking sound as the flashlight was extinguished, now leaving me blinking again as my eyes struggled to readjust to the darkness. "Hey," the cop said, "you're living in here." I couldn't really deny it from where I sat in bed with a sheet over my legs. I wanted to start screaming at the guy. Why couldn't he give me enough time to at least get dressed? And what did he think he was doing, breaking into my van? I was on public land, and I had as much right to be here as anybody. Luckily, my common sense managed to wrangle control away from the burst of fury clawing its way up my chest. Rule 1 of talking to a police officer was to be unfailingly calm and polite. It was something especially important to do that as a reporter, because sometimes we did things that were perfectly legal but that certain individual police officers might not like. I took in a breath and managed to keep myself from reflexively shouting at the guy, but not from clenching my fists and folding my arms over my chest. "Yeah, I was sleeping in my van," I said, a bit more sharply than may have been a good idea. "It's a free country." "You can't do that," the cop said. I wanted to shout at him, "Why the hell not?" but I restrained myself. "What about you?" I said. "Did you have a warrant to open that door?" I was trying not to antagonize the man too much, but I was furious, and still only half-dressed. I was clenching my fists so hard my nails were digging into my palms. It wasn't enough that almost everything I had owned had burned. Now I had to deal with this. "I told you we were about to tow you," the cop said. "I popped the lock to disengage the parking brake." I had to put a lid on my anger. For all I knew, what this guy was doing was perfectly legal. And more to the point, if I wanted to get out of this, I needed to try to seem harmless and uninteresting. If the officer thought I might cause some kind of trouble, he might start thinking about how long he could detain me. And even though I was pissed off, I tried to remind myself that the guy was just doing his job. He wasn't trying to hurt me. He must have thought that the vehicle had been abandoned or something like that. I'm sorry, I said, struggling to sound calm and polite. "But isn't this a rest stop?" "You can only park here for 2 hours, the cop said. "It's on the sign." Crap. I hadn't seen that. I really needed to avoid antagonizing this guy now. I was in the wrong here, and I would have to throw myself on the officer's mercy, hoping that he would let me off with a warning. "I'm sorry, sir, I didn't see that," I said, trying to sound as respectful as I could, while also feeling acutely conscious of the fact that I was wearing a sheet instead of pants. I had been through 2 straight days of constant indignity, from the paramedic to Lockwood's condescending tolerance of the fact that I'd slept at the office, to getting thrown out of the strip club, and now this. Couldn't just one thing go right for me? The officer sighed. Then he said, "I'll close the door and give you a second to get together your license and registration." Damn it. Did he need my paperwork because he was planning on giving me a ticket? Would it just be a parking ticket or something like that? I pulled my jeans the rest of the way on and buttoned them in a rush before pulling on my shoes and socks. Once I was fully dressed, I ducked under the curtain and stepped into the front of the cab to pull the papers I needed out of the dashboard. I opened up the driver's side window and handed them to the officer waiting outside. He took my stuff and walked back to his squad car, leaving me to a few minutes of anxious waiting. I spent the entire time biting my lip in silence. Please, no ticket. The officer walked back to the driver's side window, but he didn't hand my registration back. "Listen," he said, "if you need one, I know some shelters you can get into. Warm beds and a place you can park your van. No one's going to try to take your vehicle away from you, I promise. Your registration is still good, and so's your license." I blinked in surprise, taken aback by the compassion in the man's voice. "There's good people there," the officer continued. "They can help you get back on your feet." I smiled, genuinely. This man was starting to seem like a decent guy. "I'm all right," I said. "Really, I mean, I have a job and everything. There was just an issue with the place I was living." "You don't need to be unemployed to stay at a shelter," the officer said. That's okay." I didn't want to take up a bed at a homeless shelter. I might be taking it away from someone who needed it more than me. "Listen," the officer said, "I'm letting you off with a warning this time, but I'm leaving a description of this vehicle with the locals. If you're not willing to go to a shelter voluntarily, I can't force you to go. But if we have a problem with you again—" "I understand," I said. My voice came out strained. Damn it, damn it, damn it! This guy must be a state trooper, but when he said the locals, I was sure that he meant the Riverside Police Department. Deputy Chief Burke was going to hear that his least favorite reporter was attempting to live out of a van. The risk involved in attempting to park overnight somewhere in Riverside was about to skyrocket. "I'm going to give you 10 minutes to clear out," the man said. "All right," I said, struggling to force out a casual tone. "Thank you." I closed the driver's side door, resisting the urge to slam my fists against the steering wheel or to start spouting a stream of profanity. The officer was still close enough to hear me. Well, this was just great. I'd have to look up local vagrancy laws to see what I was up against. I was sure that Burke would love the opportunity to cite or lock up the reporter who, in his world, had embarrassed his family. I cracked my knuckles and shoved my key into the ignition to bring the van back to life. The clock switched on and reported that it was 4:30 a.m., so I'd gotten almost 6 hours of sleep. Well, that wasn't terrible, and although I was tempted to try to park at a grocery store or something to squeeze out another couple hours of sleep, I was behind on work. My attention yesterday had been entirely consumed with worrying about Zev. At least for the moment, he was safely away from Riverside, and I needed to get some stories for the next editions. There was a town council meeting this evening, but I would need more than just that to catch up. Besides, being woken up just before the crack of dawn was a great excuse for a double-shot mocha. The old man sitting on the wooden bench across from me was mopping sweat from his forehead with a hand towel. It had to be at least 80 degrees in here, thanks to a wonky thermostat that insisted on heating the windowless council chambers to a more extreme temperature than the rest of the building. With the wood paneling on the walls and everyone seated on wooden benches and sweating, the Dover Town Council meeting looked like a sauna that a bunch of eccentrics had decided to attend in formal wear. Mayor Dominic Bruno had refused to remove his well-tailored suit jacket, and his forehead was shining brightly underneath his well-combed black hair. The former mayor and current minority leader Beverly Humphrey stubbornly refused to be outdressed and kept her own pantsuit jacket on. The two of them occasionally glanced at one another, as if waiting to see who would be the first to break. Despite the unpleasant temperature, I felt a bit nostalgic about being back here. Dover was the town I had covered when I was first starting out, before Zev had joined the team. The mayor smiled broadly as he chortled his way through the consent agenda, presenting his good side to the cameras that were streaming the meeting to public access television. I was only half paying attention. I had already obtained a handout with an overview of everything that the meeting would cover, and I knew that the only story worth reporting was one of the later items in the list. I refreshed the email on my phone. Zev still hadn't gotten back to me, and I was worried that the woman who had identified herself as Isabel was going to back out of agreeing to meet with me tomorrow morning. It had been Isabel, not I, who had insisted on setting up a meeting at the crack of dawn in a public park and trying to make it look like a chance encounter to anyone watching. I wasn't sure if her caution indicated that she had some really juicy information or simple paranoia. Either way, it was likely to be more interesting than this meeting had been so far. I tuned back in as the mayor moved on to the next item on the consent agenda, the reason I had come to an otherwise dead meeting. Everyone loves a story with a dog. The well-dressed man grinned and gestured for Deputy Chief Burke to join him at the lectern. Burke mopped sweat from his bald head, which was shining as brightly as the polished badge on his uniform. Burke and I had already exchanged death glares when he had arrived 10 minutes after the meeting started. Now that people were watching him, he had put on a stiff smile as he approached the lectern and began to read a prepared statement. The Riverside Police Department had just received a bullet and stab-resistant canine vest gifted by the owner of one of the few manufacturing businesses still operating in town, the one that made submarine parts. Burke explained that Buddy, the department's canine officer, hadn't been able to show up tonight, but that a picture of the dog wearing the new vest would be going out in a press release. I sighed. No doubt, Burke would be sending the press release to his favorite news station, while the Sentinel was left high and dry. Well, it would be the man's own fault when a bit of good PR for the department lacked a photo in our next edition. I jotted down a few pithy quotes, then slapped my notebook shut, satisfied that I'd gotten the only good story that was on the agenda tonight. But that was when Burke turned to the mayor and asked him a question that surprised me.
"Since I'm already up here, can we move on to the ordinance change?"
Bruno's smile faltered for half a second, but then he took a motion to proceed with item H on the agenda early. The rest of the town council consented. I glanced down at the printout and frowned. The last agenda item on the paper I held was item G, about repairing some traffic lights.
"Absolutely, Deputy Chief Burke,"
Bruno said, turning his smile back to the camera and continuing.
"This item was a special addition to our agenda for the evening at the request of our regional police department. They are requesting Dover's consent to a proposed revision to the regional vagrancy ordinance. Could you tell us more, Officer Burke?" "I have made the council aware that our ordinance is poorly worded," Burke said. "It has come to our attention that, although the ordinance is very clear that a vehicle may not be abandoned overnight on public property, and that a person may not camp overnight in a public park, there may be some technical ambiguity regarding a person sleeping overnight inside a vehicle in a public space other than a park."
Burke finished the sentence and turned his gaze on me with a sneer. My jaw dropped open in shock. Burke had heard about what had happened at the rest stop, and his reaction to hearing that I had spent a night living out of my van had been to blitz the town council to literally change the law to make it easier to arrest me in particular. I knew Burke was an asshole, but I hadn't expected him to go this far. If Burke wanted me arrested or driven out of town this badly, maybe he had been sleeping with Angela Miller. Well, if he was the corrupt official Angela Miller had told Zev about, I was going to nail him to the goddamn wall.
"It is our belief as a department that the intention of the ordinance is clear," Burke said. "We have determined that the city of Fairview has a nearly identical ordinance that is better worded. We are asking the community to support their police department and—"
"Deputy Chief," bushy-bearded Councillor Seagartle cut in, "is there a great deal of vagrancy in the region?"
"Not with local residents," Burke said, "but we are a short drive from the Fairview Casino."
"Are there any civil liberty concerns here?" asked Deputy Mayor Cipolla, a short woman who was the youngest on the council.
"We just don't want to turn the town into a campground,"
Burke said, waving her off as he went on, claiming that the law was more of a clarification than an actual change in any rules. But it wasn't just a clarification. From what Burke said, under the current system, it was illegal to camp overnight in the van in a public park, but not illegal to do the same on a public street. Making overnight parking on city streets illegal was a substantial change, and an outright declaration of war against me. I was starting to feel sick to my stomach. Was Burke doing this because he knew that I suspected him of wrongdoing? Well, Zev had pretty much spilled the beans when he had openly asked Burke about Angela Miller. And if Burke was willing to go this far to make my life difficult, what else was he capable of? Murder? Arson? Would Burke let the law restrain him, or would he try to arrest me on trumped-up charges? And if he took me into custody, what would happen to me? Would my body be discovered hanging in a prison cell, and my death explained away as a suicide? No, the other police officers would never allow Burke to get away with something like that. Burke was pushing to change the ordinance because he needed the law on his side. He couldn't direct officers under his command to arrest me for no reason. Burke had to work within the system if he wanted to target me. The council batted a few more questions back and forth as the deputy chief kept insisting that the ordinance change should be regarded as nothing but a rewording and the closing of a loophole. The council Democrats shot barbs about how public safety might be better off if Republicans hadn't just cut Dover's share of the police department's budget, reducing local manpower. The council Republicans accused Democrats of wasting taxpayer money on excessive policing while referring to the cuts as trimming the fat. They went at it for nearly 20 minutes. For a moment, it seemed like the council might reject Burke's proposal simply because the timing on it had been so sudden. But the more they argued, the more nervous I became. The Democrats wanted to show support for the police department. They wanted to frame themselves as the party that supported the local police, complimenting their continued attacks about the budget cuts. And the town Republicans didn't want to give any more fuel to the claims that they were making the town unsafe. So they, too, would do as Burke asked. No one wanted to be the elected official who stood up and suggested that casino riffraff have a right to camp out in their cars on the side of the road.
Sounds like everything is in order, Mayor Bruno said. Because the change is simply a minor clarification, and I believe we are all in agreement here, I'm asking the council to suspend Rule 3 and Rule 7, skipping the public hearing and putting the change into effect immediately. All in favor?
The council members started giving their votes, one by one. 7 votes in favor. Damn it, damn it, damn it! I balled my hands into fists and resisted the urge to slam them into the back of the wooden bench I was sitting on. My emotions were flashing between anger and fear. Now that Burke had taken parking on the street in front of an apartment building off the table, I didn't know where I was going to sleep tonight, and there was no way I could rent a room in time. Technically, I could stay the night at the Doberman Motel. They were the cheapest in the area. But if I did that, I would be out $60. And worse, I would be letting Burke win. Screw that. I'd think of something. Chapter 12. The morning sun shimmered along the surface of the river. The trees along the bank cast shadows over the parking meters, reaching across the street toward a block of restaurants and businesses. Even this early, there was a small amount of traffic filtering through Main Street. I yawned and stepped out of my van and onto the street abutting Riverside Park, trying to blink the sleepiness out of my eyes. 2 cups of coffee had helped a bit, but did not erase the fact that I had woken up at 4:30 in the morning for the 2nd day in a row. My new commute to Riverside was long, but I couldn't complain. With a bit of internet research, I had discovered that the Fairview Casino offered free overnight parking to anyone who cared to use it. Mostly it was RVs, but the lady at the front desk registered my van and gave me a parking pass to hang on my rearview mirror without comment. She said I could stay for 2 weeks at a time and even threw in a voucher for $5 worth of slot tokens. All for free, presumably under the assumption that I would be losing money gambling. They say the house always wins, but that was only if you played their game. If you don't gamble, apparently the house just gives you free stuff. It wasn't a long-term solution, but sleeping at the casino would work for now. I was feeling pretty smug. I had done the math and found that the trip from Fairview was only costing me about $5 each way in gas. If I drove to Riverside every day, that added up to only about $300 for the month. But I wouldn't have to be in Riverside every day, since I could do a fair amount of my work at the Fairview Library with just my laptop and my cell phone. If I planned carefully, I might only need to drive to Riverside as few as 3 days each week. Val only needed me in the office the day before the papers went out, so I just had to stack as many in-person appointments on the same days as possible. If it all worked out, a 2-week stay at the casino might cost me as little as $60. 2 weeks wasn't long, but it was enough to explore other options. I sipped my vile gas station coffee as I walked over to a park bench overlooking the river. The water flowed slowly enough that I could see a clear reflection of the trees and the Cape-style houses on the opposite bank. I was about 15 minutes early. I toyed with the idea of lying down on the bench and resting my eyes, but I didn't want to risk falling asleep. Besides, this Isabel might arrive early herself. She had said that she would recognize me from the photo on the Riverside Sentinel staff page. Until she decided to show up, I had to look professional. I blinked up at the bright blue sky, hoping that the morning light would help me shake off my residual sleepiness. In the distance, a jogger was running up the path that ran alongside the river. As she got closer, the jogger noticed my gaze and responded with a friendly wave. I waved back and rose to my feet as the woman approached. A vibrantly bright blue sports bra was stretched tight across her ample chest, and her blonde hair was pulled back in a ponytail that exposed black roots. A silver belly button piercing shaped like a feather glittered in the center of the taut, tan skin of her stomach. The shorts she was wearing showed off muscular thighs and calves. The woman looked like she had walked out of a fitness magazine, a sexy one. It was a little intimidating. Part of me had an ingrained expectation that being approached by a conventionally attractive girl meant that I was about to get bullied. Just how long was it going to take me to get over high school? Now that I saw the jogger up close, I recognized her. She was the blonde dancer from the strip club, the one who had winked at me as I was getting thrown out. She wasn't wearing nearly as much makeup, but the sports bra she wore was the same shade of blue as the bikini she had been wearing in the club. I had expected the woman who was planning to meet with me to be the tough-looking bartender who had been quietly watching my confrontation with Doberman, but I guess this made sense. This woman had winked at me when I was being thrown out. "Hey!" she said, in a voice almost as bright as her outfit. Surprisingly chipper for this time of the morning. Or maybe I had just been expecting Isabel to fit my stereotype of a jaded, world-weary stripper. Hi," I said. "So are you Isabel?" "Yes." Isabel nodded eagerly before turning a nervous glance over her shoulder. She turned back to me, still smiling, but a bit too widely. Her tension was palpable behind that upbeat veneer. Isabel, though the name might be a pseudonym, had oozed skittishness in her emails, arranging a meeting that would look like a chance encounter to anyone who was watching us. It was a good thing the park was empty. The way she was nervously glancing around would definitely have drawn eyes. "You doing okay?" I asked. Isabel twitched her head left and right with one final sweep of the area before she nodded. "It's okay," I said. "I'm just here to talk. I won't write anything up unless we both agree that it's a good idea." Isabel bit her lip and nodded again. She had gone from overly chipper to mute. I put on a smile, trying to set her at ease. "Do you want to take a seat?" I said, gesturing to the bench I was standing next to. Isabel didn't seem to hear the question. I wanted to tell you to stop asking around about Angela," she said. It wasn't a threat. There was no hostility in her tone. Her false smile vanished as she glanced over her shoulder again. I could see the fear on her face. She knew something. "Can you tell me why?" I asked. "You have no idea what you're getting into. It could be really dangerous." "Did something happen to Angela?" Isabel had turned to look over her shoulder again. Finding her anxiety infectious, I glanced around as well. The park was still empty except for the two of us, unless someone was hiding up in one of the trees or under one of the bushes. Was Isabel right to be so fearful? Or was her paranoia a sign that I should be doubting her credibility? "Listen," Isabel said, leaning forward and looking me right in the eyes. "I know how this sounds, but—" 1 second we were talking. The next, a streak of black fur was flying through the air at her, its paws slamming into her shoulders and knocking her onto her back on the grass in front of me. The beast snarled a low, angry growl as it lunged at Isabel's throat, teeth bared. She managed to shove her arm in the way before the thing's muzzle could reach her neck, but its jaws closed on that arm, tearing into her flesh. Isabel screamed. I scrambled, flailing out reflexively with a kick toward the creature that did not connect, an aggressive motion intended to try to scare it away. But the animal didn't so much as look at me. I could see it for what it was now. A huge black dog, bigger than any I'd ever seen, larger than the woman it had tackled. It had a thick, heavy body with a broad chest and a massive, square head. The dog was growling, a low, rumbling sound, and its long, sharp teeth were still clamped over Isabel's arm. Blood was dripping down its muzzle. I had to do something, but I was so shocked at what was happening that I couldn't think. The massive animal moved, shifting its legs to step off of Isabel's shoulders, but keeping its jaws clamped down on her flesh. She struggled vainly as the huge dog started to move, dragging her across the grass by her arm. I couldn't just watch as the huge animal dragged Isabel away. I had to do something. Blood dripped from Isabel's arm, locked between the beast's jaws. My brain finally kicked into gear, and I lunged forward. I rushed toward the black dog and swung out with a kick, aimed at the beast's ribcage. I was trying to knock the animal off the woman, to get it to release its grip on her. But the dog rolled its massive weight underneath my kick and then raised itself, placing its spine underneath my heel. My extended foot was shoved a couple inches into the air, enough to unbalance me. I fell to the ground, hard. The breath was knocked out of me, and I was stunned. The dog had not only evaded my kick, but had responded intelligently, using my attack to trip me. It was the sort of move you expected from a human opponent, not from an animal. Of course, it wasn't like I'd ever been in a real fight before. All the experience I had was one martial arts class. Taking the class had made me feel strong, like I didn't have to be afraid of walking alone at night. But now that I was actually in a fight, even if it was with an animal, not a person, I realized that all I had learned might as well be dance moves. The dog rumbled with a low growl as it continued pulling Isabel across the grass. The woman had gone limp in its grip. She was crying. She was terrified. I had to get over there fast. I rolled up to my feet without thinking. The motion was familiar, something I had practiced hundreds of times in that class. It was something. Blood was trickling down Isabel's arm and onto the ground. I rushed forward at the dog again. This time, I swung my kick at its face, watching the animal's movements more carefully. The kick landed. I struck the beast's head, knocking it back and loosening its jaws. Isabel pulled her bloody arm toward herself with a groan, gripping her wound with her other hand. The dog turned toward me. It moved with startling speed, teeth bared. I lashed out with another kick aimed at its face, trying to keep it back, but the animal turned its head and opened its jaws to meet my swinging ankle before clamping down hard. An electric burst of pain lanced up my leg. The dog's teeth felt shockingly sharp despite the layer of denim that protected my skin. The dog whipped its head left and right, jaws pulling my leg and whipping me off my feet. I tried to tuck my head as I fell, but it still slammed onto the grass. It was softer than concrete, but I still hit my head hard enough that stars swam across my vision. I lay there dazed for a moment. I felt the dog's jaws open, dropping my leg onto the ground. My vision was only just starting to clear when the beast bounded over me, huge paws slamming onto the ground on either side of my ribcage. I could see the dog's face. Its blood-stained teeth were bared. The animal's golden eyes were glowing with a strange, bright green light inside its pupils. It wasn't a dog. It was a demon with glowing eyes. But I couldn't give in to fear. Terror was exaggerating what I was seeing. The green light in the beast's eyes must just be the reflection of the grass and the sunlight in those watery canine eyes. My hesitation allowed the dog to make the first move. It looked at me for a moment, and then opened its jaws wide and started moving its head down. Terror made time slow to a crawl. I saw the dog's teeth descending toward my stomach, ready to rip and tear into my guts. I felt my hand swinging forward before I knew what I was doing, and only just managed to ball my hand into a fist mid-swing. My knuckles slammed into the dog's head when its jaws were only inches away from me. The animal's watery black eyes bugged out with a startlingly human look of surprise as I knocked its head aside. Again, I thought I saw something crazy. I thought I saw the bright green light in the dog's eyes flicker and vanish, like a snuffed-out candle. But I knew that it was probably just the reflection shifting as the dog's head turned. I couldn't let these crazy thoughts that kept popping up distract me. I shoved them aside and swung out with my legs, kicking at the huge torso that was still hanging over me. I knocked the dog off balance and it fell down beside me. I rolled and scrambled away as I heard the dog let out a terrified whimper. Before I could get to my feet, the dog was running away, yelping. I turned my head to watch the animal as it ran off into the distance, sprinting full tilt across Main Street and dodging its way past a honking car until it reached the other side, disappearing down an alley. I was panting with exertion and terror. I felt on the verge of tears. I had never been attacked by an animal before. I had never felt that deep, primal terror of seeing bloody teeth moving toward the vulnerable flesh of my stomach. My terror had even made me see things, had made me think that the dog was something other than what it was. The animal certainly had been behaving strangely, aggressively attacking one moment and running off whimpering the next. Rabies. The dog must have been rabid. That was why it was acting so weird. Another whimpering sound brought me back to reality. This one human, not canine. I turned and saw Isabel behind me, clutching her arm. It was covered with blood, but trickling, not gushing. She was lying on the ground and shaking, tears streaming down her cheeks. I spun up onto my feet and rushed over to her. I could feel some pain lancing up the ankle that the dog had bitten when I put weight on it, but it wasn't bad. I ignored the pain and hurried over to the woman on the ground. Isabel needed pressure against that wound, and she was wearing very little, just a sports bra and jogging shorts. Wincing a bit, I considered my options. I was wearing a sports bra of my own underneath my t-shirt, chosen when I had been forced to buy new clothes because it was sold cheap in a pack of 6. It actually covered me more than the one Isabel was wearing, but I had never shown my belly button in public before, not even to go swimming. It was almost funny how I could still manage to feel self-conscious despite the gravity of the situation. But Isabel needed something to stop the bleeding, and I wasn't in the habit of carrying rolls of gauze with me. I couldn't let my discomfort stop me from helping a woman who was bleeding profusely right in front of me. I took off my shirt as I stepped toward Isabel. She twitched and looked afraid when I gently reached out for her arm. "I need to stop the bleeding," I said. Isabel gave a jerky nod. She was breathing rapidly and unevenly as I wrapped my shirt tightly around her arm. Redness quickly soaked into the fabric. "Are you all right?" I asked. I... Just try to breathe," I said. Isabel might be in shock. I didn't know exactly what the medical definition of shock was, but she seemed like she was about to pass out. After a breath, the woman nodded again, less jerkily. Her heaving chest started to slow. Life and awareness came back into her eyes. I'm okay," Isabel said. She sounded rattled, but calmer than I would have expected considering the blood-soaked shirt wrapped around her arm. "But we have to go." "It's okay," I said. "You can take a minute." "That dog might come back," Isabel said. I nodded. That was a good point. Isabel started to rise, using her uninjured arm to help herself to her feet. "Do you have a car?" I asked. "I took the bus here," Isabel said. "That's my van over there," I said. "Come on." Isabel wobbled a bit as she started walking in the direction I indicated, and I rushed to her side to steady her, grabbing hold of her uninjured arm. My ankle twinged when I put weight on it, but I didn't see any blood soaking through the denim of my jeans when I glanced down. I didn't feel any wetness either. If I was bleeding at all, it wasn't badly. As we walked across the park, I considered the mechanics involved in retrieving a new shirt while Isabel was with me. The only way to access the plastic bin full of clothes in the back of the van would expose the fact that I was living inside the vehicle. And if I did that, whatever credibility I had with the woman would be lost. We arrived at the van, and I unlocked the door to the passenger side for Isabel before I remembered that I had been keeping my dirty laundry on the passenger seat, something both embarrassing and fortuitous. I quickly shoved the laundry onto the floor between the seats and grabbed a new shirt before helping Isabel step up into the vehicle. I felt like a weight had been lifted off of my chest as I pulled the new shirt on immediately before closing the passenger door and making my way to the other side of the van. When I stepped into the driver's seat, Isabel had turned her head away from the window and pulled out her ponytail so that her long, blonde hair hung loosely and partially concealed her face. "We should go," Isabel said, "before anyone sees us together." Oh, right. This entire meeting had been structured so that no one would see Isabel talking to me. And considering the fact that Chalmers had showed up to deliver a threat 2 nights ago, the woman had a point. The fact that a dog had attacked her minutes after she started talking to me couldn't have been making her feel any less frightened. Could someone have sicked the dog on her? No one else was in the park, or at least no one I had seen. But nobody besides the 2 of us would have known that we were planning on meeting there this morning. It was just a rabid dog, a very unfortunate coincidence. I put my key into the ignition and brought the van to life. "Are you okay to drive?" Isabel asked. "I saw the dog bite your leg." "I think I'm all right," I said. But then I realized, if a rabid animal had bitten me and broken the skin, I was in trouble. I leaned down and pulled up the ankle of my jeans to check. The skin on my left ankle was blotchy and swollen, but there was no bleeding. The denim had protected me. My ankle hurt, but it was just going to be a nasty bruise. "Didn't break the skin," I said. "I'm glad," Isabel said, sounding genuinely relieved that I was okay. I started backing out of the parking space. "We need to get you to the emergency room," I said. "No," Isabel said. "I can't go to the hospital." "I think you have to," I said. "I'll be okay," Isabel said. "I think the dog might have been rabid." "It doesn't hurt that bad." I frowned. Isabel was obviously lying. I could hear the pain in her voice. "I don't think you understand," I said. "Rabies is fatal. The mortality rate is literally 100% unless you get treated in time. You don't have a choice." "I really can't," Isabel said. "Is it that you don't have insurance?" "No, I do. Isabel sighed. Then her voice got very quiet. "I think someone might be watching the hospital," she said. I frowned at that and took the opportunity of a red light to glance at the blonde woman sitting in the passenger seat. Was this paranoia? Who did she think was watching the hospital? Or was it just that Isabel didn't want to be seen with me? "If you're worried about being seen with me, I can drop you off," I said. "It's not that," Isabel said. "But you do need to get that bite looked at." "I'll be fine." I frowned. "Who do you think is watching the hospital?" Isabel was quiet for a while. Then she finally said, Someone I need to avoid.
Who?
My, ex-boyfriend. I really don't want to run into him. I glanced over at the woman. She had pushed her seat back so that she was lying down in a way that made it harder to see her through the windows. She was biting her lip, looking back at me. And I was pretty sure she was lying to me. "Is it worth risking your life to avoid your ex?" I asked. "Didn't you hear what I said? If you get infected with rabies, you'll die if you don't get treatment." "I'll just have to risk it." I gripped the steering wheel hard. I was starting to feel frustrated with the woman. I was sure that she was lying about the ex, but I didn't think it was safe to call her on it. And although she wasn't saying so directly, I thought that she might not believe that I knew what I was talking about. But I had written a story about rabies last year. I had talked to an emergency room doctor about it. I was sure I was right. Maybe the pile of dirty laundry in the passenger seat had made me look unreliable, or the fact that I had totally embarrassed myself in front of her when I had gone into the strip club. Well, if the problem was that Isabel didn't trust my assessment of her injury, I just needed someone else to back me up. Someone older and more authoritative who would tell the woman that she couldn't just ignore the dog bite. "Listen," I said, "my editor used to be a nurse. Will you at least let her take a look?" Val would talk some sense into Isabel, and she was a lot better at handling people than I was. I don't know," Isabel said. "Val's a good person," I said. "I trust her, and I know that she'd never do anything to make anyone unsafe, or say anything to anyone if you want her to keep a secret." "I don't think it's a good idea." "I won't tell her anything about you," I said. "I can just say that I was taking a walk in the park when a dog attacked you and that I brought you to her for help." "You'd tell her I'm just some random jogger?" "She'll still want to help," I said, "and you at least need to get that wound cleaned and bandaged properly." The blonde woman lay back in silence for a moment. "All right," she said. This has been Slug It, written by Charles Bran, narrated by Larissa Thompson. Copyright 2020 by Charles B. Kreutzkamp. Production copyright 2021 by Charles B. Kreutzkamp.